A black veteran walks into an upscale restaurant wearing his medals, seeking only a quiet meal. Instead, a waiter's cruelty turns the dining room into a courtroom of whispers. But when a four-star general walks through that door, the scales of justice don't just tip, they shatter. Some people wear their power on their sleeves. Others let their actions speak. The chandelier light caught the medals first: Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. They glinted against the dark blue of Marcus Hayes's dress uniform as he stood in the doorway of Belmont's, the kind of upscale restaurant where reservations required a last name that meant something. The dining room hummed with the low chatter of wealth, crystal touching crystal, laughter wrapped in silk. Then Derek saw him. The waiter's smile dissolved like sugar in acid. He moved quickly, intercepting Marcus before he reached the host stand, his body language shifting from service to obstruction in 3 strides. "Can I help you?" Derek's tone carried a question mark that felt more like a period. Marcus met his eyes calmly. "Reservation for Hayes, 7:30. Hayes." Derek's gaze traveled down the uniform, lingering on the medals with something that wasn't quite skepticism, but wasn't quite belief either. "We'll need to verify that." Around them, conversations began to pause. A woman in pearls turned her head. A businessman lowered his phone. The host, a thin man with silver hair, approached with the reservation book but stopped when Derek raised his hand slightly. "Sir, we have standards here," Derek said, his voice climbing just enough to reach nearby tables. "And I need to ask, is that uniform actually yours?" The room went quiet. 30 witnesses, 30 phones, 30 people who would decide in that moment whether to look away or look closer. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his jaw tight. The only sound was the soft jazz bleeding from invisible speakers and the thunder of his own heartbeat. Everyone heard what happened next. But almost no one spoke for him. 2 hours earlier, Marcus Hayes had stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with the same precision he'd once used to field strip a rifle. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom in a neighborhood where people knew each other's first names and borrowed sugar without awkwardness. The kind of place where Marcus felt safe. On the living room mantel sat a folded American flag in a triangle case, beside it a photograph in a simple frame. Sarah in her army fatigues, smiling that smile that could make you forget just for a moment that you were standing in a desert that wanted you dead. She'd been a medic. He'd been infantry. They'd promised each other they'd survive long enough to grow old somewhere quiet. Cancer hadn't read the contract. 3 years now. 3 years of waking up to an empty bed and cooking for one and folding the flag every morning, because routine was the only thing that kept the edges from fraying. Marcus had survived firefights and IEDs and the kind of heat that turned metal into liquid. But grief was a different kind of enemy. Patient, relentless, impossible to outflank. Tonight was their anniversary. 17 years since their first date. Sarah had always wanted to eat at Belmont's, the place with the chandeliers and the wine list that read like poetry, and the view of the city lights that made everything feel possible. They'd planned to go after his deployment ended. Then she got sick. Then she was gone. So Marcus was going alone, carrying her memory like a medal he couldn't pin to his chest. He polished each commendation carefully. The Bronze Star he'd earned pulling 3 soldiers from a burning vehicle. The Purple Heart from the shrapnel that still set off metal detectors. The Combat Infantry Badge that said he'd looked death in the face, and death had blinked first. The neighborhood knew Marcus as the man who helped veterans navigate the VA paperwork maze, who showed up when someone needed furniture moved, who never talked about what he'd done, but carried it in the straightness of his spine and the gentleness of his voice. He'd learned early that strength wasn't about how loud you could shout. It was about how steady you could stand when everything around you was chaos. He checked his reflection one last time. The uniform fit the same as it always had. The medals caught the light. He looked like what he was, a man who'd served his country and survived, but he had no idea he was about to fight another war. Entirely, the host's smile had been genuine for exactly 3 seconds. The length of time it took for Marcus to step fully into the light, and for the man to register the color of the skin beneath the uniform. "Ah," the host said, his warmth evaporating. "Hayes, you said?" "Yes, sir. 7:30 reservation." Derek appeared like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Young, clean-shaven, the kind of handsome that knew it and leveraged it for tips. His eyes scanned Marcus with the efficiency of a TSA agent who'd already decided you were a problem. "We're going to need to see some identification," Derek announced, loud enough to turn heads. Marcus reached for his wallet, moving slowly, deliberately. Years of being pulled over for broken taillights and routine checks had taught him that sudden movements were dangerous. He produced his driver's license and his military ID. Derek barely glanced at them. "And you're sure this reservation is under your name?" "I made it 3 weeks ago, because we've had issues with people using stolen credentials." Derek's voice rose another notch. A woman at table 6 leaned toward her companion, whispering behind her hand. Kaz's teenager lifted his phone, camera already recording. The manager emerged from the back, a stocky man with a thin mustache and eyes that calculated profit margins before human dignity. He assessed the situation in a glance and sided with Derek before a word was spoken. "Is there a problem here?" His tone suggested he already knew the answer and approved of it. "I'm trying to verify this gentleman's reservation," Derek said, emphasizing gentleman like it was a word in a foreign language. Marcus kept his voice level. "I have a confirmation email if you need it." "What I need," Derek said, stepping closer, "is to make sure you actually belong here. Because, no offense, but this is a 5-star establishment. We have a certain clientele. And frankly, I'm not convinced that uniform is legitimate." The words landed like a slap. Around them, the restaurant had gone fully silent. The kind of silence that feels like held breath, like people watching a car accident and unable to look away, but also unable to help. Marcus's hands clenched at his sides. The Purple Heart suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "My uniform is real," he said quietly. "My service is real. And I have a reservation." Derek laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. "Look, buddy, I've seen guys buy these costumes online. Military surplus stores sell this stuff to anyone. So unless you can prove you're actually—" "I fought in Afghanistan," Marcus interrupted, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge now, sharp as the shrapnel that had torn through his leg in Kandahar. "I led a platoon. I carried wounded soldiers while being shot at. These medals aren't props." The manager crossed his arms. "We're just following protocol." "Your protocol is humiliation?" A few diners shifted uncomfortably. One elderly man started to stand, his wife pulling him back down with an urgent whisper. The teenager with the phone kept recording, his face blank, already thinking about the views this would get. Derek's smirk widened. "Well, we have standards here, sir. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Marcus looked at the faces around him. 30 people, 30 witnesses to his dignity being dissected in public. Some looked away. Some watched with the hunger of voyeurs. No one spoke up. The medals on his chest caught the chandelier light, each one a story of survival, of sacrifice, of blood on sand and brothers. Left behind and promises made to the dead. He'd walked through fire for this country, and now he couldn't walk through a restaurant door without being interrogated like a criminal. But Marcus Hayes hadn't survived 2 tours by surrendering easily. He took a breath, straightened his shoulders, and did the one thing they didn't expect. He walked past them to an empty table and sat down. "I'll have water," he said quietly, "while you verify whatever you need to verify." The room held its breath. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he placed them flat on the white tablecloth. He focused on the weave of the fabric, the way the light hit the water glass someone had grudgingly placed in front of him, anything to avoid the stares burning into his back. His heart hammered against his ribs, not the clean, sharp fear of combat, where adrenaline had a purpose, but the messy, complicated rage of being treated like a threat in the country he'd bled for. He thought of Sarah. She'd faced this too, though differently. The assumptions that a black woman in uniform must be support staff, not a medic who'd saved lives with hands steady enough to thread arteries while mortars shook the earth. She'd taught him something crucial during those years, that discipline wasn't about controlling your anger. It was about controlling your response to it. "Let them underestimate you," she'd said once, stitching a gash on his arm after a training accident. "Their assumptions are their weakness, not yours." The room blurred slightly at the edges. Marcus blinked hard, forcing his vision clear. The Purple Heart felt heavier now, like it was pulling him down through the floor, through the earth, back to that moment in Kandahar when everything went wrong, and he'd made the choice to go back into the kill zone because 3 of his Soldiers were still breathing, and that meant they were still his responsibility. He could leave. Stand up, walk out with his head high, let them have this small poisonous victory, he could shout. Let the rage that lived in his chest, that 3 years of grief had only sharpened, finally break free. Flip the table. Make them understand what it felt like to be seen as less than human. Instead, he did neither. He sat perfectly still, his posture parade ground straight, his hands steady now, and waited. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to give people the reaction they expected. Sometimes strength looked like silence. Derek hovered nearby, whispering to the manager. Other waitstaff passed by without making eye contact. The couple at the next table asked for their check early. Marcus took a slow sip of water. The glass was crystal, probably worth more than his monthly rent. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could afford to be here, could pay for the most expensive item on the menu without checking his bank account. But money apparently couldn't buy the assumption of belonging. Outside, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered like a promise someone had forgotten to keep. Inside, Marcus Hayes sat alone, surrounded by people, and prepared for whatever came next. He'd survived worse. He'd bury this too. But somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the uniform and the medals and the careful control, something was breaking. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold the pieces together. Afghanistan, 2012, Helmand Province. The memory came unbidden, sharp, and complete. Marcus was 26, lean and fast, leading second squad through a village that felt wrong the moment they entered it. Too quiet, too still. The kind of silence that made your skin crawl. Then the world exploded. ED, ambush. The vehicle in front of his erupting into flame and shrapnel, bodies thrown like dolls. Marcus had 3 seconds to decide. Take cover or run toward the fire. His training said cover. His conscience said otherwise. He chose the fire. 3 soldiers. Ramirez with both legs shattered, Chen unconscious and bleeding from his ears. Williams screaming, trapped under twisted metal that glowed red-hot. Marcus pulled them out one by one, while bullets chewed the ground around his feet, while the heat blistered his hands, while his own blood, he didn't know where it was coming from, didn't have time to care, made everything slippery. Sarah had treated him at the field hospital after. Her hands gentle as she removed shrapnel from his thigh. Her voice steady as she told him he was an idiot and a hero in the same breath. You could have died, she said. So could they. She'd looked at him then with something like recognition, like she'd seen the shape of his character and decided it was worth keeping. They were married 6 months later, in a ceremony conducted via video call while he was still deployed, and she was stationed in Germany. The military was supposed to be the great equalizer, where rank mattered more than race, where what you did outweighed what you looked like. And sometimes it was. In the field under fire, his soldiers had trusted him absolutely. But stateside, in the spaces between deployments, the world kept reminding Marcus that the uniform only protected him until he took it off. Sarah had understood that bone deep. She'd grown up in Alabama, the daughter of a sharecropper's son who'd fought in Vietnam and come home to a country that spit on him. She'd joined the army to prove something, to herself, to the world, maybe to the ghost of her grandfather, who died believing his service meant nothing. We earn it every day, she'd told Marcus once, lying in their too-small bed in base housing, her head on his chest. The right to be seen as human. We earn it with our blood and our sweat and our silence when they disrespect us. And someday, maybe, we won't have to. She died 3 years ago, her body betraying her faster than any enemy ever could. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. Marcus had held her hand as she slipped away, had folded the flag they draped over her casket, had learned that survival wasn't always victory. These medals weren't props. They were memory and meaning, forged in fire, bought with blood. The Bronze Star represented 3 lives saved. The Purple Heart represented the shrapnel still in his leg that set off metal detectors and ached when it rained. The Combat Infantry Badge represented 217 days of looking death in the face and refusing to blink. Tonight was supposed to honor Sarah, to finally take her to the restaurant she'd dreamed about. Even if he had to take her in memory alone, instead it had become another battlefield, another place where his service was questioned, his humanity debated. his right to exist in a space challenged by someone who'd probably never sacrificed anything more significant than a parking spot. But Marcus had learned something in those years of combat, in the aftermath of grief, in the daily small wars of being black in America. Battles weren't won by the loudest voice. They were won by the person still standing when the smoke cleared, and Marcus Hayes was still standing. That lesson would save him soon. Derek returned with the manager, both wearing expressions that said they'd reached a decision and Marcus wouldn't like it. But Marcus's attention had snagged on something else. The walls. Belmont's decorated itself with military memorabilia. Framed photographs of soldiers in various eras. Shadow boxes with medals displayed under glass. A signed photograph claiming to be from General Patricia Voss, one of the highest-ranking women in the army. Marcus had met General Voss once, briefly, during a ceremony at Fort Bragg. He'd shaken her hand. She'd thanked him for his service. He remembered her signature because she'd signed his commendation paperwork. The signature on the wall was wrong. His eyes narrowed. He scanned the other displays as Derek began speaking, something about policy and maintaining standards, but Marcus wasn't listening anymore. He was reading, analyzing that shadow box near the bar. Silver star, bronze star, purple heart, except the ribbons were in the wrong order. The placement violated basic military uniform code. Any real service member would know that. That photograph behind the host stand, Marines at Iwo Jima, except the uniforms were from the wrong era, the equipment anachronistic. A detail so small only someone who'd studied military history would catch it. The signed Voss photograph. Not just the signature, but the date. She'd supposedly signed it in 2009, 3 years before she'd achieved the rank displayed under her name. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not just anger anymore, but cold, sharp certainty. This restaurant was profiting from stolen valor, decorating its walls with fake military memorabilia to create an atmosphere of patriotism, while simultaneously humiliating an actual veteran at the door. The hypocrisy was so thick he could taste it. Derek's voice cut through his analysis. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. We've been more than patient, but you're making other guests uncomfortable." Marcus looked up slowly. "Those medals on the wall, they're fake." Derek blinked. "Excuse me." The shadow box behind the bar. "The ribbons are out of order. The photograph near the host stand. Wrong era uniforms. And that signature from General Voss? I've seen her actual signature." "That's not it." The manager's face went carefully blank. "I think you should leave before this becomes a bigger problem." "How much did you pay for those?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now, sharp as steel. "Online, military surplus auction, because no real service member would display medals with the ribbons backwards." A few diners had turned fully now, watching with renewed interest. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was theater, and the script was changing. Marcus pulled out his phone. Derek moved to intercept him, but Marcus was faster, snapping photographs of the wall displays, the fake signatures, the fraudulent memorabilia. Evidence. Proof. "What are you doing?" Derek demanded, reaching for the phone. Marcus stepped back, holding it out of reach. His heart raced, but his hands were steady now. In combat, he'd learned to find calm in chaos. This was just another mission. "Documenting," Marcus said quietly. "Because if you're going to question my service while profiting from fake displays of sacrifice, people should know." The manager's face flushed red. "You need to leave now before I call the police." Some diners looked away. Others pulled out their own phones, recording. The balance in the room was shifting, not entirely in Marcus's favor yet, but tilting, uncertain, pregnant with possibility. Derek stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You think anyone's going to believe you over us? You walk in here with your costume and your attitude." "Costume?" Marcus's control finally cracked just slightly. "I earned every piece of this uniform. I bled for it. And you're standing in front of fake medals calling me a fraud." The manager placed a hand on Derek's shoulder, pulling him back. "This is your last warning. Leave voluntarily or we will have you removed." Marcus looked at the faces around him, some sympathetic now, others still unsure. The teenager with the phone filming everything, his expression unreadable. He could push this further, make a scene, force them to physically remove him. But Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "Choose your battles. Win the war. Marcus straightened his uniform, adjusted his medals, and turned toward the exit. The weight of defeat settled on his shoulders like snow, cold, heavy, inescapable. He was 3 steps from the door when he heard it, the distinct sound of a car door closing outside. Footsteps on pavement, purposeful, military. The door opened, and everything changed. If Marcus was right about what he'd just photographed, if those displays were really fraudulent, then this restaurant wasn't just guilty of discrimination. They'd built their reputation on lies. And when the truth came out, if it came out, everything they'd constructed would collapse, like a building with no foundation. The question was whether anyone with real power would care enough to make it happen. The answer walked through the door in a dress uniform, with 4 stars gleaming on the shoulders. General Patricia Voss was not a tall woman, but she filled the doorway like a declaration of war. 53 years old, silver threading through her dark hair, shoulders back in a posture that had been earned through 30 years of proving herself in rooms that didn't want her there. Her uniform was immaculate. Her expression was stone. The restaurant froze. Marcus turned slowly, his hand still on the door handle, and felt something crack open in his chest. Not quite hope, not quite relief, but something close to vindication. Voss's eyes swept the room with tactical precision. Derek near the bar, his smirk faltering. The manager halfway between the kitchen and the dining room, suddenly pale. Marcus in his dress uniform, medals catching the light, standing at the threshold like a man who'd already been shown the exit. Her gaze locked onto Marcus's ribbons. Recognition flashed across her face, sharp, immediate, certain. "Sergeant Hayes," she said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that made colonels stand at attention. "Is that you?" Marcus's throat tightened. She remembered. Fort Bragg 3 years ago, the ceremony where she'd personally presented his Bronze Star. They'd spoken for maybe 2 minutes, but generals like Voss didn't forget the faces of soldiers who'd earned their medals in blood. "Yes, ma'am," he managed. Voss walked into the restaurant like she owned it, which in every way that mattered she did. Power wasn't about the building. It was about who people listened to when they spoke. And when a 4-star general spoke, rooms rearranged themselves around her words. She stopped 3 feet from Marcus, her eyes moving from his face to the medals on his chest, to the obvious tension in his shoulders. "Someone want to tell me," she said, her tone conversational but carrying an edge that could cut glass. "Why a decorated war hero is being escorted out of this establishment." Derek opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Ma'am, there was a misunderstanding about his reservation." Misunderstanding. Voss repeated the word like she was tasting it and finding it rancid. "About a reservation. For a man wearing a Bronze Star Purple Heart and combat infantry badge." The manager stepped forward, his voice oily with sudden deference. "General, I'm certain this is just a communication issue. We absolutely honor our military. In fact," he gestured to the walls, "as you can see, we celebrate service here." Voss followed his gesture. Her eyes landed on the displays, the shadow box, the photographs, the signature that claimed to be hers. Something shifted in her expression, subtle, dangerous, like ice cracking under pressure. "I see," she said quietly. Marcus watched her face, saw the moment she recognized what he'd already discovered. The fake memorabilia, the fraudulent displays, the restaurant that wrapped itself in patriotism while humiliating actual patriots. For a moment, the room balanced on the edge of something. Hope that power would side with justice. Fear that even a general's word wouldn't be enough to overcome the comfortable prejudices of people who'd never had to question their right to belong anywhere. Derek seemed to sense an opportunity. His confidence returned, buoyed by the manager's smooth deflection. "We were just following our standard verification procedures, ma'am. We have to be careful about..." "Careful about what?" Voss cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "Careful about allowing actual service members into your establishment." The manager raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Of course not. We were simply..." "Save it." Voss turned back to Marcus. "Sergeant Hayes, did you have a reservation here tonight?" "Yes, ma'am, 7:30, under my name." "And what happened when you arrived?" Marcus kept his voice level, factual, the way he'd learned to give after-action reports. "I was questioned about whether my uniform was legitimate, asked to provide excessive identification, told I didn't meet the establishment standards. Asked to leave. The room was silent except for the soft jazz still bleeding from the speakers, ridiculously inappropriate now, like elevator music in a combat zone. Voss nodded slowly. I see. She looked at the manager. I have a reservation as well. 8 o'clock. I'm early. She paused, letting the weight settle. Should I expect the same treatment? Of course not, General. You're absolutely... Why not? The question was a trap, perfectly laid. Is it the uniform? Because Sergeant Hayes is wearing his dress uniform. Is it the rank? Because valor doesn't wear stars, it wears scars. The manager's face went from pale to grey. Derek had gone completely silent, shrinking back toward the bar like he could disappear into the shadows. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Or perhaps it's something else entirely. The words hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the room knew what she meant. No one wanted to say it out loud. Marcus felt the balance shifting again, but doubt still gnawed at him. He'd seen this before. The outrage, the promises, the moment where it seemed like justice might actually happen. And then the quiet retreat, the careful explanations, the way power always found a way to protect itself. Would even a general be enough? Or would the manager find some excuse, some loophole? Some way to make this all go away without consequence? Voss pulled out her phone. I think we need to examine your military displays more closely. Sergeant Hayes, do you mind if I see those photographs you took? Hope flickered in Marcus's chest. Small, fragile, dangerous. But even as Marcus handed his phone to General Voss, even as she began scrolling through the images with an expression that grew darker by the second, he felt the familiar weight of doubt crushing down on his shoulders. How many times had he been here before? Not in this exact moment, not with a general as witness, but in the larger pattern, the moment where justice seemed possible, where someone with power seemed ready to care, and then nothing. Bureaucracy, complications, the quiet suggestion that maybe he'd misunderstood, maybe he was being too sensitive, maybe it was better to just let it go. 3 years ago, Sarah had filed a complaint about discrimination at the VA hospital where she was being treated. A receptionist who consistently lost her paperwork, who made her wait hours longer than white patients, who questioned whether her military insurance was valid. Sarah had documentation, witnesses, a clear pattern the hospital had investigated, found no evidence of intentional bias, suggested improved communication protocols. The receptionist still worked there. Sarah had died still bitter about that small, stupid injustice piled on top of the cancer eating her alive. Marcus had learned then that having proof wasn't enough, that being right wasn't enough, that even dying while wearing your medals wasn't enough to make people see you as fully human. The dining room watched Voss examine the phone, but Marcus watched their faces. The couple at table 6 looking uncomfortable now, guilty, like they were remembering their silence earlier and finding it sour. The businessman checking his own phone, probably calculating whether this scandal would affect him. The teenager still recording, his eyes bright with the hunger for content that would trend. Witnesses? Always witnesses, never allies. Derek had retreated behind the bar, his face carefully blank now, but Marcus could read the calculation in his eyes. This would blow over. It always did. Rich people protected rich establishments. Generals had better things to do than follow up on complaints from one sergeant who'd been asked to leave a restaurant. Marcus's hands were steady now, not with confidence, but with the numb acceptance of a man who'd learned not to expect miracles. Outside the window, the city glittered, indifferent, beautiful, unreachable. Inside, Marcus stood in his dress uniform, his medals catching the light like small, useless prayers, and wondered if Sarah had felt this same exhaustion in her final days. This bone-deep weariness that came from fighting battles that should never have needed fighting in the first place. The Purple Heart felt heavy. The Bronze Star felt like a lie. What was the point of service if the country you served treated you like a threat the moment you tried to exist in its civilian spaces? Voss was still scrolling, her jaw tight. But would even a general's outrage be enough? Or would she make her statement, express her disappointment, and then leave him here with people who would smile to her face and spit on his name the moment she walked out? Marcus took a slow breath. The air tasted like expensive wine and old money, and the particular bitterness of hope deferred. He'd survived worse than this. He'd bury it like he buried everything else, In the same place he kept his grief for Sarah, his rage at the VA, his exhaustion at having to prove his humanity every single day. But for just a moment, standing in that restaurant, with a general holding evidence of fraud and discrimination in her hands, Marcus Hayes let himself feel the full weight of what it cost to keep standing. It was crushing him, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold the pieces together. Then General Voss looked up from the phone, and her expression was not disappointment. It was fury. Cold, controlled, absolute. "Sergeant Hayes," she said, her voice carrying across the room like a command. "Do you recognize the signature on that photograph?" She pointed to the frame behind the host stand, the one claiming to be signed by her. Marcus straightened. "Yes, ma'am. I've seen your actual signature." "That's not it." "No," Voss agreed, her tone sharp as a blade. "It's not. Because I never signed this photograph. I've never been to this establishment. And if I had," she turned to face the manager fully, "I certainly wouldn't have endorsed a place that treats decorated veterans like criminals." The manager's face went from grey to white. "General, I'm sure there's an explanation. The previous owner may have committed fraud." Voss's eyebrows rose. "Interesting defense." She walked to the shadow box behind the bar, Derek scrambling out of her way. She examined it closely, her fingers tracing the glass without touching it, her eyes cataloguing every detail with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 decades in uniform. "This ribbon rack," she said quietly, "is wrong. The order violates basic military standards. The Bronze Star takes precedence over the Purple Heart in display. This shows the Purple Heart first." She moved to another frame. "This photograph claims to be from Operation Desert Storm, but those digital camouflage uniforms weren't introduced until 2004. She turned back to the manager. "Shall I continue? Or would you like to explain how a restaurant that allegedly honors military service manages to display memorabilia that any actual service member would recognize as fraudulent?" The room was silent. Even the jazz had stopped. Someone in the kitchen had finally read the room and cut the music. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not hope yet. Hope was too fragile, too easily crushed. But something harder. Something like certainty that at least one person with power was willing to use it. Voss pulled out her own phone. "I'm going to make this very simple. You have 2 choices. Choice 1. I walk out of here right now, and by tomorrow morning, every major military advocacy organization, every Veterans Affairs office, and every news outlet I have contact with, which is substantial, will know that Belmont's discriminates against actual veterans while profiting from fake military memorabilia." The manager opened his mouth. She held up a hand. "Choice 2. You address this situation immediately, publicly, and comprehensively, starting with an explanation to Sergeant Hayes and everyone in this room about what happened tonight and why it was unacceptable." Derek finally found his voice, thin and desperate. "Ma'am, I was just doing my job." "We have to be careful about what?" Voss's gaze swung to him like a spotlight. "About black men in uniform. Because I'm looking at Sergeant Hayes's ribbons, and I'm looking at you, and I'm trying to understand what careful means when a man who earned his medals pulling soldiers from a burning vehicle gets treated like he stole his uniform from a costume shop." The words landed like artillery. Precise, devastating. The kind of truth that cleared the air by burning everything else away. The teenager with the phone was still recording, his hands shaking slightly now, probably realizing he was documenting something bigger than a simple confrontation. Marcus watched Voss work, saw the tactical precision in every word, every pause, every calculated revelation. This wasn't just anger, it was strategy. She was building a case in real time, creating a public record that couldn't be quietly buried later. And Marcus understood in that moment what Sarah had tried to tell him 3 years ago when she was dying and bitter and still somehow hopeful. One person with power, willing to use it for justice instead of comfort, could change everything. Not always, not easily. But sometimes Voss turned back to the manager. "So what's it going to be? Public accountability or public scandal? You have 30 seconds to decide." The manager looked at Derek, at Marcus, at the phones recording everything, at the diners who would talk, who would tweet, who would make this moment live forever in the digital memory of a world that never forgot and never forgave. He made his choice. "Derek," the manager said, his voice hollow, "you're fired. Effective immediately." Derek's face went slack with shock. "What, you can't?" "I can. I am." The manager turned to Marcus, his expression carefully arranged into something meant to resemble remorse. "Sir, on behalf of Belmonts, I sincerely apologize for the treatment you received tonight. It was completely unacceptable and does not reflect our values." "Stop." Voss's voice cut through the apology like a scalpel. "Don't insult him with corporate language. Say what actually happened." The manager swallowed hard. The room watched, breath held, every phone camera capturing the moment for posterity. We discriminated against you based on assumptions about who belongs in our establishment. We questioned your service without cause. We disrespected your uniform and your sacrifice." The words came out stilted, forced, but they came. "There's no excuse for that." "I'm sorry." Marcus stood silent, watching the man's face, reading the calculation behind the apology. This wasn't genuine remorse, it was damage control. The manager wasn't sorry for what happened. He was sorry it happened in front of a general with the power to destroy his business. But sometimes, Marcus thought, you didn't get the apology you deserved. You got the apology fear provided. And you took it because it was better than nothing. "Not good enough," Voss said, and Marcus's attention snapped back to her. She was examining the wall displays again, her phone out, photographing each fraudulent piece. "These displays. Where did you source them?" The previous owner left them. "I just kept them up." "For atmosphere." "Atmosphere." Voss's tone could have frozen water. "So you inherited fraud and chose to perpetuate it. Interesting business model." She tapped her phone screen. "I'm calling the military fraud hotline. This needs to be reported officially." The manager's face went grey. "General, please. If this becomes public..." "It's already public." Voss gestured to the room full of phones. "The question is whether you cooperate with an investigation or fight it. But either way, these displays come down tonight. All of them." She put the phone on speaker. The room listened to it ring once, twice. Then a crisp voice answered, "Military Fraud Hotline, Sergeant Cooper speaking. Sergeant, this is General Patricia Voss. I'm calling to report suspected stolen valor and fraudulent use of military memorabilia at a civilian establishment." She rattled off the restaurant's address, her tone clinical, professional. "Devastating." The manager sank into the nearest chair, his face in his hands. Derek tried one last time. "This is insane." "I was just doing my job." "Your job," Marcus said, speaking for the first time since Voss arrived, his voice quiet but carrying clearly across the silent room, "was to serve food. Not to judge whether I deserve to eat it." Voss finished the call and turned to the assembled diners. "For those of you recording, and I see several phones up, I want to be clear about what happened here tonight. Sergeant Marcus Hayes, a decorated combat veteran who earned his medals in Afghanistan, was denied service and subjected to humiliation based on discriminatory assumptions. Meanwhile, this establishment displayed fraudulent military memorabilia to create an illusion of patriotism while disrespecting actual patriots." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That's the story. Make sure you tell it accurately." A woman at table 6 raised her hand tentatively, like she was in school. "General, I saw what happened earlier. I didn't speak up. I should have. I'm sorry." Others murmured agreement, a wave of delayed conscience washing over the room now that it was safe to have one. Voss nodded. "Then speak up next time. Before someone with stars on their shoulders has to walk through the door." She turned to Marcus. "Sergeant Hayes, I'm taking you to dinner. Officers' Club at Fort Meade, my treat. And we're going to file a formal complaint with the Equal Opportunity Commission on the way." She looked back at the manager. "You can expect visits from health inspectors, military liaisons, and probably the press. I suggest you use that time to examine exactly how this establishment operates and who it serves." The manager didn't respond. He looked like a man watching his livelihood crumble in real time. Derek was already pulling off his apron, his face red with humiliation and rage, the taste of his own medicine bitter on his tongue. Voss walked to the nearest table, the elderly couple who'd almost intervened earlier. She addressed them directly. "You almost stood up. Next time, don't hesitate. Silence gives permission." The old man nodded, shame and respect warring on his face. Then Voss turned to Marcus, and for the first time since she'd entered, her expression softened. She came to attention and saluted him, a four-star general saluting a sergeant, an act of respect that transcended rank and spoke to something deeper. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Hayes," she said. "And I'm sorry it took someone like me walking through that door for you to receive the respect you earned years ago." Marcus returned the salute, his throat tight, his eyes burning. The medals on his chest caught the light one last time. Not prayers now, but proof. Proof that he'd earned the right to stand here. Proof that sometimes, rarely, justice actually showed up. The restaurant erupted in applause, the same people who'd watched his humiliation in silence now celebrating his vindication with the enthusiasm of bystanders who wanted credit for a battle. They hadn't fought, but Marcus barely heard them. He was looking at Voss, seeing Sarah in her fierce certainty, remembering every veteran who'd faced this same discrimination and hadn't had a general walk through the door at the right moment. "Thank you, Ma'am," he said quietly. Voss nodded. "Let's get you that dinner you came here for. Somewhere that actually deserves your business." They walked toward the exit together, leaving behind a room full of phones and excuses and people who would tell this story like they'd been heroes in it all along. Behind them, the fraudulent medals glittered on the walls, their lies finally exposed. Ahead of them, the door stood open, and Marcus Hayes walked through it with his head high and his medals gleaming and the weight on his shoulders just a little bit lighter. The Officers' Club at Fort Meade was nothing like Belmont's. No chandeliers, no crystal, no carefully curated atmosphere of wealth. Just honest tables, service members in various uniforms, and the easy camaraderie of people who understood what the ribbons on your chest actually meant. Marcus and Voss sat across from each other, their meals simple and good. She'd insisted on ordering for both of them, her way of ensuring he actually ate something after the adrenaline crash she knew was coming. 3 weeks, Voss said, cutting into her steak. "That's how long ago you made that reservation?" "Yes, ma'am." "It was supposed to be." He paused. "My wife and I had an anniversary. She passed 3 years ago. She always wanted to eat there." Voss set down her fork. "I'm sorry." "So am I." Marcus took a breath. She would have loved how this ended, though. Sarah had a thing about justice. She hated it when people got away with things. Smart woman. The best. They ate in comfortable silence for a moment. Around them, conversations rose and fell. Shop talk, gossip, the daily rhythms of military life that Marcus had missed more than he'd realized. Voss wiped her mouth with her napkin. "Belmont's will close within the month. Between the fraud investigation, the discrimination complaint, and the social media explosion," she smiled grimly, "they're finished. The manager's already getting calls from investors pulling out." Marcus nodded slowly. He'd expected to feel triumphant. Instead, he just felt tired. "Derek will have a hard time finding work in the service industry," Voss continued. "Not impossible, but hard. Sometimes consequences actually land where they should." "And the other diners?" Marcus asked. "The ones who watched?" "They'll tell themselves they were about to intervene, that they were just waiting for the right moment. That's what bystanders always do." Voss leaned back in her chair. "But maybe a few of them learned something tonight. Maybe next time they'll speak up sooner." Marcus thought about the woman at table 6, her delayed apology, the shame in her eyes. Maybe. Or maybe people were just good at feeling guilty after the fact, when it cost them nothing. His phone buzzed. Text messages flooding in. Veterans groups, news outlets, old army buddies who'd seen the videos already circulating online. The story was viral now, spreading like wildfire through military communities and beyond. One message stood out. From Williams, one of the soldiers he'd pulled from the burning vehicle in Afghanistan, the one who'd been trapped under burning metal. "Just saw what happened. You saved my life in Kandahar. Wish I could have been there to return the favor tonight. Proud to have served with you, Sarge." Marcus's eyes burned. He typed back a quick response, then pocketed the phone. "The military teaches us a lot of things," Voss said quietly. "How to fight, how to lead, how to survive. But it doesn't always prepare us for fighting battles that shouldn't exist, for having to prove we're human in spaces that should just accept it." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry you had to fight that battle alone. For as long as you did tonight, I wasn't alone at the end. No, but you shouldn't have needed a general to walk through the door for people to treat you with basic decency." They both knew she was right. They both knew that for every Marcus Hayes who got lucky, there were dozens who didn't, who faced discrimination in silence, who left restaurants and stores and offices carrying humiliation they'd never asked for and didn't deserve. But tonight, at least, one small victory had been won. Marcus touched the purple heart on his chest, the medal that represented pain and survival, and the shrapnel still in his leg that ached when it rained. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. We earn it every day, and someday maybe we won't have to. Maybe not yet, but maybe someday. Voss raised her water glass. To your wife, and to making sure her dream of that dinner finally happened, even if the location changed. Marcus raised his own glass, feeling the weight of grief and vindication mixing into something he couldn't quite name. To Sarah. She would have liked you, ma'am. I would have liked her too. They drank. The officers' club hummed around them with life and laughter, and the sound of people who'd earned their place at the table and didn't have to prove it every time they sat down. Marcus looked around the room, at the mixed faces, the various ranks, the easy integration that the military managed imperfectly but genuinely. This was what it was supposed to look like, this casual acceptance. This baseline respect at outside through the windows. The base lights glowed steady and strong. Inside, Marcus Hayes sat with a general who'd used her power for justice instead of comfort, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like maybe Sarah's faith in the world hadn't been entirely misplaced. The silence felt different now. It sounded like respect. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. The videos went viral. Millions of views, thousands of shares, countless think pieces about discrimination and stolen valor and the cost of silence. Derek's face became a meme for prejudice exposed. The manager's apology was dissected and found wanting. General Voss became a symbol of accountability in action. But Marcus Hayes, the man at the center of it all, mostly just felt quiet. He returned to his small apartment, to the folded flag and Sarah's photograph, and sat in the stillness that followed chaos. The phone calls slowed. The interview requests tapered off. The world moved on to its next outrage, its next injustice, its next viral moment. And Marcus was left with the same truth he'd always carried. Respect isn't something you earn once. It's something you have to earn again and again in every space, with every interaction, until the world finally decides you've paid enough for the privilege of being seen as human. But something had shifted. Not in the world. The world was still the world, still full of derricks and silent bystanders and establishments that wrapped themselves in patriotism while practicing prejudice. But in Marcus himself, he'd stood his ground. He'd documented the truth. And when power finally arrived, he'd been ready with proof instead of just pain. Sarah would have been proud. The uniform didn't make Marcus Hayes a hero. The uniform was just cloth and thread and dye. What made him a hero was the choice to walk into that fire in Kandahar, to pull his brothers out while bullets chewed the ground, to keep standing when everything in him wanted to surrender. And what made him heroic that night at Belmont's was the same thing. The choice to stand his ground with dignity when cruelty tried to make him small. Derek learned something that night, though Marcus doubted he'd admit it. He learned that power without principle is just cruelty in disguise. That assuming the worst about people says more about you than them. That humiliation has a way of circling back to find its source. The manager learned that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. That profit built on lies eventually collapses, that you can decorate your walls with symbols of sacrifice while knowing nothing about what sacrifice actually costs. And the diners, those 30 witnesses who watched and filmed, but didn't speak, maybe some of them learned that being uncomfortable with injustice isn't the same as opposing it, that intentions without action are just another kind of silence, that the next time they see someone being diminished, they'll remember how they felt watching themselves watch and do nothing. General Voss didn't just shut down a restaurant that night. She shut down the lie that rank matters more than righteousness, that stars outweigh scars. That power exists to protect itself instead of protect others. Marcus stood in his apartment, looking at Sarah's photograph, at the woman who'd taught him that dignity was something you carried inside, something no one could take unless you surrendered it. We did it, he whispered to her memory. That dinner you always wanted. We finally got there. Different restaurant. Better company, but we made it. The medals sat on his dresser, no longer heavy with humiliation, but light with purpose. They represented his service, yes, but also his survival, his refusal to be erased, his insistence on occupying space in a world that kept trying to tell him he didn't belong. Somewhere out there, Derek was learning to live with the consequences of his cruelty. Somewhere the manager was watching his business collapse, under the weight of exposed lies. Somewhere, people were having conversations about discrimination and dignity, and the distance between patriotic decoration and actual respect. And in a small apartment where grief and vindication lived side by side, Marcus Hayes stood in his civilian clothes, looked at his medals, and made a choice. He'd wear the uniform again, not because he had to prove anything, but because he'd earned the right to exist in it without apology. The world would keep testing him, keep demanding proof, keep making him fight battles that shouldn't need fighting. But Marcus Hayes had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, Sarah's death, and a restaurant full of people who decided he was less than human. He'd survive whatever came next too. They'd laughed at him once, questioned his service, tried to make him small. Now the world stood at attention, and Marcus Hayes stood tall,